Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and today I'll attempt to do the impossible, talk about Power Rangers Samurai without bringing up my myriad of Jaden nicknames, a task I am fully prepared to fail at. But maybe not, because as the title suggests, today we're going to be in large part defending Jesus of the Jaden clan. I already failed. So, with all that said, let's dive back into Samurai and discuss how the structure of the team only served to fail the two people who are the most important characters skills-wise. Power Rangers Samurai has been referred to as many things. The most apt description was delivered in a comment on my original Samurai video, calling this season Shinkenger with a 4Kids dub, and that's already problematic. Not as much the 4Kids part, but the sloppy way the cultural aspects of Samurai are implemented. There was literally no reason to give a Japanese last name to a very not Japanese character, and also no good reason to have Mia as the only Japanese character in a season rooted heavily in Japanese culture. And even that is a wonky arrangement since Erica Fong herself isn't Japanese. None of that makes any sense, but it does present us with an interesting conceptual clash, and it could have worked, in theory. Because what they could have done is create something akin to the deeper cultural narrative of Wendy Wu Homecoming Warrior. For those of you not in the know, allow me just a minute to highlight the best aspects of this criminally underrated decom. So the basic rundown is this. Wendy, portrayed by Brenda Song, is a new generation Yin warrior meant to defeat an evil spirit called Yan Lo alongside her mentor / love interest Shin Koyomada. But she resists the call of her alleged destiny at first because 1, it sounds crazy, and 2, because of the subtle idea of embracing a more westernized vision of life. A vision not as constrained by destiny or tradition and more about free spirit and individuality. You know, American stuff. But because the plot has to happen, she eventually does buy into this whole Yin warrior thing. Then goes through some awesome training, in part featuring our own James Galen, and then shows up for the final fight. Ironically, the Homecoming Warrior in question actually skips Homecoming to kick Evil's butt. I know this is getting long-winded as per usual, but here's the important part. Shin is supposed to die in this fight. That's his destiny, but Wendy changes that by saving him and ending Yan Lo forever. Why does that matter? Because she represents both an Eastern and a Western mindset, being both Asian and American. So, the movie allows her to embrace both by changing and embracing her calling as a Yin warrior. Flat out brilliant. As you may have guessed from that nostalgic praise session, Samurai does none of those things. Rather, it embraces collectivism and tradition where it shouldn't, and embraces individuality in areas that actively hurt the team. For example, remember when everyone collectively thought the best course of action was to protect Jaden at all costs? All this simply to abide by the conservative stance of ending the fight in one very specific way. Just the thought was probably enough to make Kevin blush, but the point is this. Nobody outside of Jaden eventually really calls this notion out for being stupid. Because if someone dies protecting Jaden, then 6 Rangers become 5 and Sandrid has a massive advantage. And even for as much as he wishes it were the case, Jaden would not have won the Nylok fight all alone. Even Mentor G knew as much, and he's a terrible mentor. Nothing interesting or even functional is done with the ways Eastern and Western mentalities, generally speaking, would naturally clash, and they could have easily brought that into focus, since the plan of sealing Xandrid away didn't work, thus bucking the trend these samurai were trained for. At best, we get a couple of questionable attempts at that type of cultural clash with Mike and Antonio, since we can see how both were trying to balance that difference. And because of this glaring problem, we end up with a set of Rangers and a mentor that aren't characterized in ways that help the Shiba family, both collectively and individually. So now, let's talk about the siblings in question. Jaden as a character is problematic, mainly because, as I've often pointed out, he never really internalizes the arcs he goes through, and because of that, he has to keep relearning the lesson of togetherness, only to forget it again the second Decker comes begging for another fight. But Jaden also deserved better. You'll notice that in Origins, his initial mentality towards having teammates was lukewarm at best. Despite being a relatively low-key character, he's cocky as all hell, and neither his mentor nor any of his teammates ever effectively challenged that perspective. Heck, the dude literally introduces himself on a high horse, which no one takes issue with. The symbolism is so brutally on point that it's laughable. But then what happens? Kevin happens, and everything he represents. Kevin could have been a pretty good character, but at any given time, you'll find him praying at the altar of White Kirito. Hey, I think that's a new one. But then you keep going down the line and you quickly realize that it's not just Kevin or G. Nobody is pushing this guy to change. We talked about some of the issues of Samurai's tradition-based collectivist approach, but here is where we see the flaws in their individual approach. Emily is a good character, but she's way too meek to get at Jaden. Mia is way too nice to chastise anyone. Antonio is just as amicable and is also Jaden's friend from childhood, so no go there. And Mike is the least motivated to be here, so he'd come off worst of all challenging anybody, as he did when he challenged Lauren, but we'll get there. When we talked about Jungle Fury, we discussed a system of people surrounding Casey that could facilitate his growth. He does not become a great ranger without that. But what we see with Samurai is a team structured in the exact opposite way of what Jaden needs. That's on top of a mentor that seems to have less authority than Bulk does. There is a high value to mentorship in rangers. From where I'm standing, the two best added or extra rangers are Kruger and RJ, specifically because they teach so well. So what went wrong here? The main issue of G is that he doesn't really have a presence as a mentor, and here's why. When Antonio proves himself as a valuable teammate, it's not G's doing, it's mainly Antonio's. In fact, G was the one that wanted nothing to do with the best character here. When Kevin and Mike are at odds for the 1000th time, Mentor G doesn't guide them, they guide themselves. And anytime Jaden does anything that falls out of bounds, G doesn't really confront him, he just says his boring piece and then sort of goes along with it. His idea of mentoring is so generic and underwhelming and ultimately unimpactful that not having him around changes nothing about the season. Conversely, could you even fathom how hollow SPD would feel without Doggy Kruger? Jaden Shiba is not a great ranger, but he also deserved better. He was presented as the kind of ranger who was clearly not ideal for team leading initially, and we see that time and time again. But then, he was given the type of team that couldn't help him develop any of those necessary skills, because nobody could, or wanted to, speak up loud enough for Jaden to actually hear. And with zero sense of true internal conflict, you can't expect anyone to truly change, because they haven't been given a reason to. Time Force was almost like that. Most of the team seemed pretty okay with having this unrefined stranger join them because he fights good. Thankfully, there was one huge difference between this and that. Trip is great. I love Trip, but if everyone had the same initial thoughts on Wes as Trip did, Time Force would have been terrible. Nobody grows alone. People change people, and Jaden didn't have the right people around him, which I guess makes the lack of character growth more realistic, but it certainly doesn't make for a better show. Now let's segue our discussion into Lauren Shiba.
Do you want to spar? I'm pretty good with the sword.
What? What the fuck?
Boy, this'll be fun. Let's cut through the crap right away. No, I don't think it's particularly important that Lauren is female, at least to the extent of the larger point, which I'll get to. If this had been Big Brother Luke, and Mia was the one fawning over his quote-unquote sword, this entire plot point would have probably been just as bad. But the fact that she happens to be female is made to matter because of how Rangers presents it. Make no mistake, Rangers has given us plenty of exceptional female characters, including my favorite ever. That's not the issue here. But what's undeniable is how female leaders, not named Jen, have had a rougher time. Case in point, the type of blatant condescension Mike implores does not happen if Lauren was Luke. As such, gender is forcibly spotlighted in a negative way. Same thing happens late in SPD. In Jack's case, the leader of a team that is commanded by a dog, whose boss is a bird, is somehow shocked that a woman can wear red. A very hollow attempt at humor, since by this point, even Sky now knows that Sid being a girl would never inherently preclude her from being a leader. She has plenty of other traits that would make her unideal for that job, but her gender isn't one of them. Also, Delphine was barely around, and Taylor got stripped of her role as leader only because Cole wore red. Those last 2 points aren't as heavy, but they still add to the almost consistent plight of that type of leader. But I won't get too deep into that here, because going any further would likely mean carefully sidestepping a bevy of socio-political landmines. Now here's the larger point. This obnoxious moment is just that. One singular moment in a not good season of Power Rangers. What's more problematic is not Lauren the female, but Lauren the character, placed into an impossible situation. But even though she ends up failing, her failure does add up narratively. The core of Power Rangers is teamwork, so one additional late game element shouldn't have more say than the established team in ending the conflict. That's a good enough idea in theory, but again, in practice it flounders, because this cast was Jaden, Shiba, and the backup dancers first, and the Samurai Rangers second, and that very well established worship culture also leaves Lauren dealing with a mopey, uninspired team. A team that would sooner drag Jaden back kicking and screaming than support someone who could have saved the damn planet. It's unsettling, honestly. And again, we reach the whole point of this video. This very poorly thought out team and their dysfunctional dynamic does nothing to help either Red Ranger. So with Lauren, not only does she fail, but there was no possible way for her to succeed, in large part because nobody in the show really wanted her to, except maybe Antonio. This reflects poorly on Mentor G, maybe most of all, who had absolutely no reason to keep Lauren a secret from the Rangers, but does so anyway. Seriously, what's to be gained from G keeping the endgame plan away from the Rangers who are placing their trust in him, the same Rangers that need to help execute that very plan? If they knew many episodes beforehand that she'll be the closer, this awful 3 to 4 episode stretch is probably much less awful, because now they have time to adjust, and more importantly, time to prepare. But as is, it was a horrendously conceived plan that honestly deserved to fail. Adding to that, Jaden goes off on his own again, because without his loyal subjects, his life apparently has no meaning. By now, we're used to this tired routine, but this time, it's arguably more egregious than anything Mike does. This man did not lose his powers, and at worst, he could have been around as a source of guidance and support for his sister, who, as we've discussed, was in severe need of support. But, just like how Overdrive forgot about their civilian powers and straight up abandoned the Ranger mission for a while, Jaden forgets his own powers and decides that fighting Decker, again, alone, again, is more important than helping his so-called friends and family. I mean, sure, none of that is out of character for Jaden, but it still looks pretty damn bad. What we have here is a very serious riff in the Rangers that never cleanly resolves, because it's only after Lauren is forced out of commission does the team become Jaden's again. To me, that could have been the perfect chance to take a page out of the Time Force playbook and have Lauren willingly surrender leadership. Not just because she failed, and not because she got sidelined due to injury, but because she recognizes how much better the team is with Jaden leading it, at least relatively speaking. But unlike the Alex situation, in this instance, she actually does get to fight side by side with the others, which would be perfect symbolism for burying the tension of the previous episodes, wherein her attempts to integrate into this team fell flat. And then, maybe their Rangers Together tagline might actually mean something, if only at the very end. All in all, Samurai as a season was in many ways defined by its supporting cast. A cast that never should have been viewed as simply supporting, but for the most part ended up that way. None of them, save Mike, are all that terrible individually, and with Antonio and Emily, you had actual backstories there to add substance to their current status. But, as a collective, as a team, they ultimately didn't add much to Samurai as a story, which in turn created a disconnect between them and their leader that was never genuinely corrected. Yes, Jaden could have been the one to correct it, and he didn't. But him being a very below average leader, and his team still acting like he's the second or maybe the third coming, says way more about everyone else than it does him. I don't want to make too many excuses for Jaden, because he necessarily has to carry some of the blame, but you can't really blame him completely when this is what he had to work with. And then Lauren comes around, something nobody is pleased with because Mentor G kept her a secret for no actual reason until the very last minute. So now, her very important job is made nigh impossible because of the cacophony of errors made before she even arrived. And that's not even factoring in Xandred's anti-sealing cheat code, making her job literally impossible. All of this resulted in a fairly solid despite limited screen time character looking like a pointless character when it was all said and done. But interestingly enough, Shattered Grid ended up giving her an important role in a very expansive storyline, something I didn't expect going in. I wouldn't say it makes up for all this, but I did like the angle of taking a character we don't know much about and letting her get a bit of shine. Those are some of my thoughts, But as per usual, these topical videos are much more about dialogue and discourse than me just throwing points at you, so make sure to share your own thoughts on Samurai and the Shiba siblings down below. And as always, thanks for watching.